Hi there, welcome to Indycar. My name's Gordon Ross, and in the show today I'm talking about the Brexit deal, or rather the lack of a Brexit deal, and how things are going for Dominic Raab with Michel Barnier in the negotiations so far. Now, news has leaked out recently that Michel Barnier has basically said that he thinks the Chequers Agreement is rubbish. It's not ever going to be agreed to by the European Union in any way, shape or form. And also this week we see that old slug revealing himself again. Man I used to call Jabba the Hutt, the great David Coburn MEP, the famous UKIP member who somehow got himself elected as a Scottish member of the European Parliament. And he is rubbishing Michel Barnier today and complaining that Barnier is setting himself up to become the president of the EU Commission. Now, that aside, doesn't really surprise me that Mr. Coburn would attack Mr. Barnier. After all, Mr. Coburn's entire reason for existence is to rubbish Europe, and at the same time to take money from the European taxpayers in payment for being a man in the inside trying to destroy the European Union. How he managed to get elected as an MEP is still a mystery to most people in Scotland. However, we've also had this week Labour's Brexit spokesman, Mr. Kinnock. I'm presuming this is Kinnock Jr., son of the great Neil Kinnock. Anyway, Kinnock Jr. or Kinnock Minor is also rubbishing the Chequers Agreement, and he described it as being dead in the water. Pretty much the view of almost everybody except Dominic Raab. And people are now asking Mr. Raab why he continues to flog this dead horse. It's not going to get up and walk. The Brexit deal that was hammered out at Chequers, as soon as it was announced, members of the cabinet who had signed up to it instantly resigned. So how does that leave the British negotiations for Brexit? Well, it seems to leave them in tatters, because there's nothing to negotiate. If this deal is so unacceptable to the European Union, then we're back to square one again, and the British government has got to go back to the drawing board and come up with something sensible. And while the British government is trying to do that, it's worth remembering the Good Friday Agreement. Now, those of us who live on the mainland of the UK, and particularly in Scotland, although we're a bit nearer to Ireland, might be aware that the Good Friday Agreement basically was based on the principle of consent. Now, that meant that both the Irish Republic's government and the British government had agreed that whatever happened in Northern Ireland would only happen with the consent of a majority of the people in Northern Ireland, and therefore nothing would change unless they specifically asked for it to do so. But built into the Good Friday Agreement and the power-sharing executive that it enshrined in Northern Ireland was this caveat that in the event where things went so badly wrong that no government, no devolved government was possible, and it looked like there were some intractable difficulty between what's effectively the British part of Ireland and the Republic part of Ireland, if there was some difficulty between them that couldn't be resolved, then there would be a border poll. Now, this is the name given to the referendum on the reunification of Ireland. What's interesting about this proposal about the reunification of Ireland is that, of course, it would solve the problem of the border after Brexit, because if Northern Ireland became a part of the South, then it would remain in the European Union. The question is, would the loyalists, would the British loyalists who live in Northern Ireland ever accept that? And so there were some caveats attached to this plan. One of them was that those people living in Northern Ireland who wished to be so could keep their British citizenship, and they would keep their devolved parliament at Stormont, and that devolved parliament would continue to run the 6 counties of the north, although on paper they would form part of Greater Ireland, the whole of Ireland. So territorially, the north would return to being part of the main island of Ireland. But in terms of political power, the political power would remain with the people who ran Stormont, and that would be a mixture of the Protestant loyalist side and the Catholic Republicans, who would govern their 6 states together, their 6 counties together. So the British, if you like, the British Northern Irish would get to keep their citizenship and certain other rights and responsibilities of being British, and at the same time share power with their Republican neighbours in Stormont. The only difference would be that there would be zero border at all. The whole country would be treated as one European state. Now, this is the only realistic option for squaring the circle of what happens to Ireland after Brexit. And eventually, it might come to the point where the people in Northern Ireland, regardless of their background, regardless of their faith or their traditions, might have to just decide to bite the bullet and say, okay, let's reunify on paper. Let's get rid of the border issue completely. We'll keep Stormont, we'll keep our traditions, and we'll keep the power-sharing executive that we have at the moment. We're just going to call it part of Ireland. Instead of Northern Ireland, we'll just be living in a place called Ireland. It is just a semantic exercise, switching the name from Northern Ireland to just Ireland. And the Northern Irish Parliament would only govern, if you like, those 6 counties, and it would do so by consent of the population, both Catholic and Protestant. There's nothing wrong with the proposal, but it would take some selling to the unionist side in Northern Ireland to accept it. They would need to have some built-in guarantees to keep their traditions alive as they see them, their traditions, and to create an acceptable compromise, because the original acceptable compromise was the Good Friday Agreement. If that fails because of political events overtaking it, then there has to be another option, and the other option is the border poll and reunification. And incidentally, it would have to be agreed in the south as well. It meant that people in the Republic would have to have a poll and agree to the reunification as well. It would be both sides deciding this, not just Northern Ireland. So an interesting proposal there. Nothing wrong with that in theory, and in fact, if push came to shove, if it was the only way the British government could find to get any kind of meaningful trade deal, they might be prepared to compromise. Let's wait and see. In other news, we hear today from the Hume Institute that Scottish productivity has flatlined. It's basically gone into the doldrums. Productivity is not improving, it's just staying pretty much level. And they say this as though it's some kind of criticism of industry. To me, it's an achievement that we've managed to keep any productivity, given the size of the crisis that faces the exporting industries of Scotland at the moment. And so the fact that productivity is more or less flat and is staying the same, it's not an indictment of Scottish industries. It's actually an indictment of British policies in the wider world, and particularly the threat of Brexit to our industries. Now, members of the board of the Hume Institute, the executive members, include big companies and organisations like the Scotch Whisky Association, just for example, and other much larger organisations, including the Scottish Government and big insurance companies, banking sector, big law firms. And all of these really are part of this think tank. But the problem is they see the flat line of GDP, of people's productivity, as a bad thing. But it's not. If it was a bad thing, then productivity would be going down. It would not be stable. Remember that what I was telling you recently about the world economy has stagnated because the capitalist growth model can't grow anymore. And therefore we need to get used to the idea that both GDP and our productivity will probably stay at this level now forever, because we can't grow anymore. If we start to grow more than a certain amount, we will use up too many resources and we will create too much inflation, and whatever we manage to create in terms of growth will not be sustainable into the future. And this is why the SNP's model for sustainable growth is so important. It's very modest, but it has to be very modest because the conditions that it's forced to work in are changed. No longer can we see massive returns on investments anymore because there is no interest being paid on money anymore. Money is virtually interest free at the moment. You cannot make money by hoarding it. The only way you can make the economy work at the moment is to keep money circulating through it, and that means activity of all kinds, and it means trade of all kinds. But it does not mean that you will end up with growth. What it means is you need to balance your economy so that your GDP and your productivity are strong, stable, and not going down. And that's basically it. One other news item today is from the railway side of things, and the Border Railway in Scotland, which runs from the Scottish borders to Edinburgh, reported this week that it has grown, the number of traffic has grown, increased every year in the 3 years that rail service has been in existence. Because it's a new line, nobody could really anticipate the growth of passenger numbers, but it's gone from about 1.3 million journeys in its first year to 1.5 million this year. So they're seeing good, strong growth. They're seeing jobs being created around the railway, and because of that link now between the borders and Edinburgh, it's easier for people to commute from the borders into Edinburgh or other places in the central belt. And this is important because the borders has always been a very isolated place to live. Anybody who lives down in places like Annan and Dumfriesshire knows this, that it's very rural and there are no big conurbations anywhere, and there are no big clusters of employment. And so people have to find a way of living in the countryside, or have to have a way of commuting over a long distance to get to a job in the city. And this railway provides them with the ability to do that. So this is a good news story for Scotland, that its railway system, and having opened a new line to the borders, has increased the traffic into and out of Edinburgh, and also increased the job prospects for people living in the borders themselves. We could do with more of these infrastructure projects linking the outlying, more rural areas with the cities, so that it's possible for people to commute over longer distances successfully, quickly and cheaply, without having to rely on unreliable bus services or to drive everywhere they go. It's also been mocked this week that the First Minister introduced the very first electrically powered first responder ambulance cars in Scotland. I know it might be in the whole UK. These are new BMW electric cars. They're very fast, and they allow first responder paramedics to get to the scene of accidents or incidents very quickly, and to stabilise a patient well before an ambulance can get to them. And this is part of the government's rolling programme to electrify all the public sector rolling stock. So that's all the vans and cars and other vehicles used by the public sector in Scotland to deliver services. So we'll be seeing a lot more electric buses. I hope to see more electric taxis. But in the main, at the moment, we're looking at the electrification of public services such as the ambulance service. It won't be long now before the police are using electric vehicles, because despite people's initial impressions of electric vehicles, they are extremely fast. And some of the fastest cars, like the Tesla for example, although they're terribly expensive, don't now need to be expensive, because the technology for the batteries has improved so much. So instead of buying a BMW 3 Series as a pursuit car, they might now be buying something else instead, which is electrically powered and far quicker off the mark. Either way, it's good to see the Scottish Government is also putting in place plans for another 15,000 charging points for electric vehicles across the country, as well as the huge network of new fibre optic cables being laid all across the country. You will find roads being dug up for this. It's a nuisance, but it's a big infrastructure project happening now. So despite Brexit chaos, Scotland is staying afloat. It's keeping its businesses running and ticking over quite nicely, and its infrastructure projects are going ahead despite the catcalls and criticisms of the useless British parties, which have nothing at all positive to add to Scottish politics. They just sit and carp from the sidelines. They carp and they criticise and they poke and they prod and they mock, but they have no other role in Scottish politics. They make no positive input at all at Holyrood. Anyway, time for me to go. Have a good weekend, everybody, but remember, Brexit is going to go wrong. It's already showing all the signs of failing. Their major flagship is now dead in the water. It's been admitted by virtually everybody. and the European Union will not be accepting it. And about 2 weeks before March the 29th, the European Union cut-off date will stop all negotiations at that point. If they haven't reached a trade agreement by that time, the European Union will either impose one or there won't be one. But the European Union has said that there's now a marker, a time marker. They will not negotiate with the UK after that 2 week period just before the 29th of March. That's when it will stop. That's when all the chickens come home to roost, and that's when the UK will discover its fate. Remember that Brexit is permanent, and also remember that if there is no trade deal, then we will be leaving the EU with nothing and nothing at all. Talk this month about the Tories bringing in a new piece of legislation to allow in non-EU manual labourers to pick fruit is a desperate gamble, because where are these people going to come from? Most of the fruit pickers used in Scotland and in other parts of the UK come from Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe is in the EU. So where are they going to find these foreign workers who are not EU? I don't know. But again, it's looking more and more desperate for the United Kingdom. Scotland is looking more and more stable and strong and ready to go as soon as the referendum is called. Bye bye for now.